Turn your living room into a joyful, hands-free playroom with CoComelon Sing and Play with JJ. Your child sings, moves, and learns right alongside JJ and friends, all on the big screen. It's designed thoughtfully to spark speech, rhythm, and coordination through songs and active play. Try an ad-free, safe, and interactive way to make screen time part of their learning and growth. Parents love how easy it is, voice-controlled and frustration-free. Kids love every moment of singing, laughing, and playing along. It's fun for them, and it's feel-good for you. Available now in the Volley app on your smart TV. Just search Volley in your TV's app store and start your free trial of CoComelon Sing and Play with JJ today. That's CoComelon Sing and Play with JJ, available now in the Volley app on your smart TV. Search Volley and start your free trial today.
Volley. Welcome to Homeschooling Outside the Box, the podcast that encourages and equips moms to homeschool an outside-the-box child. Hey there, this is Cindy Renna, and today we are talking with Julie Bogart. She is the creator of the award-winning, innovative Brave Writer program, teaching writing and language arts to thousands of families each year. She's also the host of the popular podcast I'm sure you've heard of, A Brave Writer's Life in Brief. Julie homeschooled her 5 now grown children for 17 years, and she's the founder of the Homeschool Alliance, which supports homeschooling parents through coaching and teaching. Julie, thank you so much for being on today.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Like your bio said, you homeschooled for 17 years, which is so inspiring for us who are kind of in the early part of that homeschool journey. So can you just tell us a little bit maybe about your background and your family and your homeschooling journey?
Yes, definitely. So I have 5 adult kids. My oldest son is 32. My youngest daughter is 23. And my oldest is married and they are expecting their first baby. So I'm about to become a grandmother for the first time. So that's very exciting. All 5 of my all 5 of my kids are gainfully employed. And I think that's important to share because all homeschooling parents are the most worried about that. Will they ever leave home? Will they ever find jobs? Will they ever find love? And at least in my family, that has worked out so far. I became interested in homeschooling before I was even married. I was introduced to the concept by a good friend of my almost then fiance who approached me in 1984, I guess it was. And he said, Julie, are you going to homeschool the children you have yet to have? And I remember at the time saying to him, homeschool? What is that? Like I had never heard of it. And he went into his little sort of speech about the need to protect values and to subvert the government control and all those kinds of sort of conspiracy theory style reasons for homeschooling.
Yeah.
But the part that really stuck with me and the reason I was so intrigued so early on is that he said home education was an opportunity to tailor make learning to the child and to build a really close family unit. And those 2 ideas were really interesting to me, even before I was married, even before I had children. So by the time my kids were actually born, I had done some reading, I had met homeschooling families, and I suddenly realized that this was a lifestyle I really would enjoy, that the experience of parenting in that intimate way that happens from birth through about 5 or 6 could continue, that I didn't have to interrupt it with filling out a lot of paperwork for the local school district.
Right.
So that's how I decided to homeschool.
Wow, that is incredible. Okay, so in addition to all that you do on Brave Writer, which is so much and just wonderful, so we're going to get into more of that later in the books you've written. One of the reasons I asked you on today is because you are also a big lover of poetry.
Yes.
So I am also a big lover of poetry. That was, in fact, my first love. And so today we're really going to talk a lot a lot about poetry and why it's so important and how you can weave it into your homeschool. And I want to open with a quote from my favorite book that talks about this is my favorite explanation of poetry. And it's actually a children's picture book. And it was written about Emily Dickinson. It's by Michael Bedard, and the title of the book is Emily. But he says in the book, "What is poetry?" I asked. He laid the wilted petals in his palm. "Listen to mother play. She practices and practices a piece, and sometimes a magic happens, and it seems the music starts to breathe. It sends a shiver through you. You can't explain it really. It's a mystery. Well, when words do that, we call it poetry."
Oh,
And don't you love that?
I do. It's gorgeous.
Yes, and it's poetry really can be this transcendent thing that we just, you can't quite put it into words. You can't stick it in a box. And I think that might be part of the reason people are intimidated by it or scared off of it. So today I really want to encourage moms to not, to press into it and not be scared of poetry, because poetry really, really matters. And so what would you say, Matt, makes it matter? So on a soul level, why do you think poetry matters? And then also really cognitively and historically, poetry has been around forever. I mean, it's really one of the first art forms. So I think there's a big importance in teaching it and preserving it. But why do you think poetry matters?
Poetry to me is the name we give to language that we intentionally play with. So most of the language we use is familiar. It comes from an unbidden place. It's just our natural daily expression. We talk, we chat, we answer the phone, we introduce people to each other, we explain ourselves. Most of that would be what we would call some form of dialogue or prose. And most writing is some version of that. It's either explanation or storytelling or sequence of steps. It's prose in its style. It is just that expression that comes out as close to speech as it can. Of course, there is a slightly different use of language in writing than speech, but they come from the same place. Poetry to me says, now I'm going to take that language and I'm going to intentionally play with it so that it does a few things. One, it has a musicality, sort of a rhythm or a song, a sound or a cadence or a rhyme, or, it's almost like the first time you hear someone sing and add in harmony. Poetry is like that. It just adds another layer to language where you feel the playfulness and you notice the words. You aren't just hearing the meanings, but you're actually noticing the word choices that go with the meanings. And then the second part of poetry, beyond the intentional playfulness, is that the message that's being communicated is frequently, not always, but frequently more cogent or more concise. It is packing as much meaning as you can into a shorter form of language. So it's why we love nursery rhymes and tongue twisters and Hallmark cards and song lyrics. We think sometimes of poetry as being the epic ballad or something, as though that is the highest form, when we use poetic expression frequently, whether it's all the songs we have memorized by Britney Spears, or NSYNC, or we are actually reading, somebody like Shakespeare or someone like Seamus Heaney. What we're experiencing when we're in the presence of poetry is a regard for language and its powers to entertain and communicate.
Yes, and I think if you look at it from the historical perspective, that if you want to understand a period of time, find the poets, find the artists. I mean, if you need to know what it was like during the Civil War, you've got to read, Oh, Captain, My Captain. Like, you have to, that is the closest I feel like you can get to being in those shoes. And it's done in a very succinct and tangible way, to where you're not having to read tons and tons of books, but to really capture a moment. I think a poem is so able to do that.
Yes, and it seems that people who are inclined toward writing poetry, the poets, are the ones who feel the deepest, right? They
Yeah.
feel deeply. So they are trying to encode an experience and put it in language that's powerful enough to connect with the reader. I think it really is why we love songs so much. We
Yeah.
have the melodies to help us memorize the lyrics, but of course, before recorded music, poetry was a kind of music by itself, even without instrumentation in the background. And I think that's why the two go together so beautifully.
Right, definitely. So on that note of it being read aloud, I think the lyrical type of poems that you get, I'm talking more of the rhyming and not so much the
Yeah.
free verse. Those especially, I think, are just meant to be read aloud. But what would you say in your homeschool and your life? What are some of the benefits of reading poetry aloud?
Poetry, because it is a linguistic form of musicality, benefits from the auditory. So I notice even for myself, like to read a poem silently and then to read it to myself aloud, I hear it
Mhm.
differently. I notice the words, I feel them pop through my lips or slither down my tongue or get caught as a catch in the back of my throat. There is
Mhm.
a muscularity to poetry that helps you connect at that body or visceral level that I think is really powerful. I actually am going through a period where my vocal cords need surgery. They have a cyst on them and they're a little bit rough around the edges. And I was meeting with my vocal specialist talking about, overuse or whatever. And I said to her, how is it that some of these male singers who use their voices even more than I do and kind of do that screechy sounding
Mhm.
yelling when they're singing, how do they get by? And she said that men actually have stronger chords. They tend to have they
Oh,
can
wow.
weather that more. And I said, what's interesting to me about it, and the reason I'm tying this to poetry, is that it's one thing to read a lyric, and it's another to hear someone scream it or
Yeah.
to emote it, where they're like, ha ha, or
Mhm.
they're choking up as they're saying it, or they are, doing a rap where it's so fast you can barely wrap your mouth around the lyrics.
Mhm.
That sort of physicality to poetry, it's almost makes it like a sport of the mouth.
Yeah.
You feel skillful. I think it's why so many kids are attracted to rap and hip hop. It is like the athletic version of language. Like, can I
Yeah.
spit out all these lyrics at the right pace, doing it at this speed, making sure I hit the cadence? And so
Right.
that's why it's important to read it aloud. It's why tongue twisters are nothing on a page, but you
Right.
read the tongue twister aloud and your tongue is twisting and there feels almost like a triumph that comes when you can wrap your tongue in your mouth around it. So even when we get into the more subtle types of poetry where we're not racing the clock or certain beats per minute or trying to do a tongue twister with all alliteration, there is a sentient quality. There's maybe even a sensual quality to allowing the language to audibly move through your body, the channel of your body. It
Mhm.
creates a kind of connection to the meaning that you wouldn't get otherwise. So that's why I'm a big fan of reading it aloud.
Right. And I mean, you nailed it. We're so quick to read over it where we would miss something, whereas you have to read every word when you do when you read aloud. And Shakespeare, I'm sure you've heard this, was known for putting words in there that were difficult to say next to each other. So you would really have to slow down when you
Mm,
read, and you'd have to intentionally read, this one chunk we've memorized. I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where ox lips and the nodding violet grows. I mean, you
nice.
cannot rush. You can't rush through that or you're going to lose multiple words. And so you have to stop and really focus on what kind of flowers are those, and it really helps you to paint the picture in your mind too when you're reading it aloud. Okay, so I'm sure you did read poetry aloud in your homeschool, I assume. Okay.
Frequently. Yeah.
Frequently. Did you incorporate it any other way? Because I want to talk to you about poetry and tea time in a minute. I know that's something else you're really known for, but did you incorporate poetry in other ways besides reading aloud?
Yeah, so we did spend time, especially with my teens, we spent a lot of time in song lyrics. I noticed that sometimes parents think, oh, teenagers won't be interested in poetry or in poetry tea time or whatever, and we'll talk about that. And I would always say, if you can access song lyrics, you will have a window of insight into the poetry that is the most important to your teenagers right now. Interestingly, my son Noah, the 32-year-old, who's a huge metalhead, loves, heavy metal rock music. He loved Rage Against the Machine, and he loved Metallica, and Linkin Park, bands that I was unfamiliar with when he was a teenager. And I went out of my way to join with those with him. And he said just this weekend, I saw him just yesterday, in fact, and he said, Mom, I was looking back through some of the songs that I really loved when I was in high school, and I was noticing the metaphorical layers that you were trying to show me then, and I understand them even better now at age 32. And I kind of cracked up. I said, isn't that funny? He said, well, you were always so keen to help me see the bigger picture. And I remember at the time thinking, she's overdoing it. That can't be true. And he's like, it's amazing what a decade and a half will do. Suddenly, just seeing it. And so literally the way that we encountered it, we did it through poetry. Two of my kids were a part of a Shakespeare community, so they were acting out the plays. All of my kids ushered at our local Shakespeare. We have a Shakespeare resident community here in Cincinnati, and they ushered at all the different plays. We looked at poetry when it was related like to a historical moment, just what you said. We used to bring in the poets for whatever period of history that we were studying. I remember we listened to Seamus Heaney's Beowulf on audiobook all together. That was big for us. We read the Epic of Gilgamesh aloud. So it wasn't always oriented towards tea. Our library had a poetry slam group for junior high kids. So
fun.
Two of my kids were in junior high. Oh, that's a cute story. Do you want to hear this? This is
let's hear it.
Yeah. So
and make sure everyone knows what a poetry slam is.
I'm not good. So poetry slam is oral. You stand up at a mic and you either recite a poem or you read a poem you've written or you recite one that you've written. And it's usually almost like an open mic format. So our local library decided to start a poetry club for junior and senior high kids. And then once a month, they would convert the meeting room into what almost looked like a coffee house. They would bring in like theater lighting, and they had round tables, and they had things to drink and eat. And everybody would sit there, and there was a mic in the front. Now, before my two oldest kids joined that group, they were writing poems about ballet and skateboards, very ordinary subject matter. So I send them off to this group. They go, it's on a Friday night, so it's really, feels grown up. And I'm not with them. They're just with all these other, mostly public school kids. They were probably the only two homeschoolers.
Yeah.
And they come home, and that Monday, they're like totally pumped. They want to write poems. I said, all right, let's write poems. So Johanna wrote a poem about a child confined to a wheelchair, and Noah wrote a poem about suicide. And I said, what has gone on? And they said, Mom, you have hidden from us the true meaning of poetry. We're supposed to write about suffering. And all we've been exposed to is like nursery rhymes and children's poetry. And of course, they have no experience, obviously, with those topics. We didn't have anyone handicapped in our family. No one had killed themselves. But they immediately plunged themselves into this dark place. And I just thought that was amazing. And we had a really good conversation about the range of feeling poetry could address. It was pretty funny.
That is hilarious, because there is sort of a feel about some of the poems, or so even writers, will get like the distraught, struggling angst and all that. And it's like, well, it's broader than that, but it definitely, that's a great outlet for it too.
Yeah, it was funny. But so yes, poetry sort of transcended just one day a week. And by the time my kids were in college, they were all actively involved in poetry as young adults, independent of me. So it's been a life sustained practice for all of them.
Mm. That is great, and I love that they've carried it on. Okay, well let's address this before we get into the poetry and tea time and kind of how to implement it and your books that I want to recommend. Let's talk to the mom who, if she stayed with us for 20 minutes or however long we've been recording here, I'm very proud of her. But what about the mom who hates poetry? And I can't believe that exists, but I'm sure it does. And how can you help the moms to love poetry? Because we all know if you're going to sit down and read something, you better love it, because your kids are going to see right through you and they're not going to enjoy it. And that's a huge part of reading aloud and doing something as a family, is really kind of being on board with it yourself. So how can we get the mom? Do you have any tips for her to how to love poetry?
Oh, definitely. So first of all, there's no requirement to love all poems. It's perfectly okay to say that this poem is unintelligible, or I don't like this poem, or this poet bores me or creeps me out or doesn't appeal to me. I think one of the things that happens when you're dealing with a prestige subject like violin, like Latin, like poetry, anything that is sort of elevated as a special class of subject area, is that you feel, to show that you are getting it, that you have to leave your own reactions and tastes off to the side. So
that is so good. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first thing to know is you still get to not like something. In fact, you might not like it right now, and over time change your opinion later when you feel more comfortable. So initially, do not start with the hard cases. Don't pick poets, from the Renaissance period using Old English. Don't start with Chaucer.
Right.
Start with children's poetry. Start with humor. I always recommend that you just go to the library, look in the nonfiction section for the poetry, shelf, and then just start pulling down books based on the pictures. Don't worry about what's inside. Just grab books. Oh, it's Raining Pigs and Noodles. That sounds funny. Let's pull that one off the shelf. Oh, here's one by Caroline Kennedy. I've heard of her. This anthology has pretty paintings. I'll try this one. And then what you want to do is follow your children's lead. They have not yet been ruined by the school system where they overanalyze poetry and turn it into a testing subject. What you want is to remember wordplay. Just like when you would sing Ba Ba Black Sheep to your child, or you'd count how many little piggies went to market. That's all poetry is. It's rhythmic language aimed at some kind of delight or emotional outcome. So any nursery rhyme, any tongue twister, any knock-knock joke, any poem written for children, especially those with humor, are a great place to start, because as an adult, one, you'll get the joke. You will. You'll get it before your kids do. And number two, there's no requirement to do anything with it other than enjoy it. So we always start with the easiest access point, with the most pleasure, with the least requirement to do anything with it.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good way to start. And I love that you mentioned to start with children's poetry, because I've even had adult friends who confess they don't like poetry, and I will give them a children's anthology. One of my favorites is the Julie Andrews collection. Are you familiar with that one?
I am. That's beautiful.
Oh my goodness. It's so good. And that is the book that my children fell in love with poetry through. And then, of course, from there, there's a couple A.A. Milne in there. So then, of course, we went on to read just his stuff. And so the anthologies are really good jumping off place, instead of just handing them a book of Dickinson or Poe or something really heavy and meaty. Do the treasuries and find, oh, I like this, I don't like this. And I'm so glad you said that about, you get to still have an opinion. You don't have to like it just to like it, because I, growing up, had always loved poetry, and then I got to college and my degree is in writing, and that's I pretty much went to school to read a lot of great books. That's what I got to do. But in my poetry classes, it was very unpopular at the time, or it was not in vogue to be writing in rhyme. And so the first poem I turned in, my professor was like, well, it's nice, but it rhymes, almost like I had part of my underwear showing or something. Like it was this embarrassing, they couldn't believe it thing. And I'm like, oh, but I like rhyming poetry, and that we did not read any rhyming poetry. We did not. I remember the only rhyming poem I remember from that time period was reading Daffodils, which is to this day probably my favorite poem. But and I'm going to link to all of these in the notes. So if you're listening and you want the titles of these books or these poems, I'm going to link to everything. But that was huge for me, because then I felt like this right, like I wasn't sophisticated enough, or my writing wasn't sophisticated enough. And it's so funny, because now that I've been out of that, and now while I'm teaching my children, I mean, we only read rhyming. Like we've all realized none of us really like free verse, and we don't get into the beat poets too much and all that. And so that's okay. Like you can still have your style of poetry and be reading poetry. That still counts. So I think that's a great way to help the moms out. Okay, now for the kids, I would say this next topic of poetry and tea time is really how to entice them, right? Because if you bring the food, they will come.
Yeah, yes.
You want to talk to us about poetry and tea time? Because that's a practice we love in our home. We've done it for years, and it's one of our favorite times of day. We don't get to it every day, but it's just such a joy when we do it.
It is striking, really. I remember back in the 1990s, I was on, an email list for homeschooling parents back in 95 or something. So it was the dawn of the internet, and we were all just pooling our collective ignorance and hope. And I remember a mother saying that she was trying to teach her children all the geographical terms like archipelago. I still remember that. It was like A to Z geography terms. And she said they were kind of resistant. So she decided to make tea. And I remember hearing that and realizing I drank British tea every day. That started when I was pregnant. I had a British midwife, and I adopted this habit of daily tea. And so my kids love teacups, and they love tea in our house. And it suddenly dawned on me, I had always, like you, grown up actually loving poetry. My grandfather gave me a book of poems in 1967 when I was only 5.5 years old, and I loved them. It was such a special treat to be given this precious book that came all the way from New York, that I was predisposed to thinking poetry was a good thing. And I was also a natural writer. So I always loved poetry, but I had been around adults now for a while, and the vast majority I met did not like it. And I worried that I would try to introduce my children to poetry and they would hate it. So here I was on this email list where a mom was talking about pairing tea with teaching a subject her kids didn't seem interested in. And I thought, that's what I need to do. I'm going to take the thing I value, which is poetry, and I'm going to pair it with the thing my kids love, which is treats and tea time. And we're going to see if that will create a soft landing for this otherwise cranky subject that so many people don't like. So what we did is we set the table with like a tablecloth. I sent the kids outside to find little nature items to create a centerpiece. We lit a couple candles. We got out my mother's china, and everybody had a real teacup. And then we made muffins, and I made tea. And then we took all the poetry books that we had collected from the library and from our bookcases in our apartment, and I just stacked them on the table. And while they were eating and drinking, I told them to just page through and find a poem to read aloud, or if they weren't readers yet, to just find a poem that I could read aloud for them. Now, here's what's interesting. In those early years, we didn't even have poetry books that had pictures. So my little kids who couldn't read yet, they were literally just randomly picking a page, which still works. If you really think about it, they're like looking at a page and they're thinking, well, there's words on this page. I wonder what they say. And then you hand the book over to your mother and she makes those words come to life. What an amazing moment of pre-literacy experience for that small child,
Yes.
and then they're like, oh, I
Yes.
turned this page and now it's completely different words that magically come off of it.
Mhm.
For the older children, fabulous reading practice, because poetry,
Yes.
it has a ton of white space around it. It often rhymes, which helps kids make an educated guess about the
Mm.
words that are a part of this cadence. And because it's short, they don't tire out as easily. So they can read 4 stanzas instead of a whole chapter aloud. So, what we discovered very, very quickly is that nobody was happy just reading one poem. They all wanted to read 2, 3, 4, get me to read some. And it became the vehicle for the happiest experiences of our homeschool.
Mm.
If a day was going
That's
wrong,
wonderful.
all I had to do was say, let's have a poetry tea time, and it would turn the whole day around. They learned
Yeah.
so much without me teaching. They
Mm.
started recognizing rhyme and alliteration and onomatopoeia without even knowing what to call those things. And then,
Right.
gently over time, I could call them out, but it became this, like, I don't know, just this vehicle of family connection and deep linguistic joy for our whole family.
That's right. And I'm sure some of those experiences helped shape one of your earlier books, which is one of my absolute favorites. It's called The Poetry Tea Time Companion. And I love this book. I'm going to let you talk about it a bit, but I just love how practical it makes. Okay, we want to do this tea time. Here's some already selected poems that we can go with, because I like the idea of how you said bringing them all to the table and just having them pick, and I think that's awesome. But you already loved poetry, and so, and same with me, like I think that's wonderful. But for the mom who's maybe a little more apprehensive about it and doesn't know, is this a quote unquote good poem, as relative as that can be, it's so nice to have something already put together. So talk to us about kind of where that book came from, and how it's put together, and how it's really a vehicle for an easy experience.
Yeah, so because Poetry Tea Time caught on and parents could easily implement it, and it doesn't cost anything, right? Like, you don't have to buy a program, anyone can do
Right.
it. But similar to what you're saying, we could start with Jack Prelutsky and Shel Silverstein, but some parents are thinking to themselves, well, how do I introduce the classics if I don't even know what they are? So,
Mm-hmm.
Poetry Tea Time Companion sorts through all these poems that are well loved. They've stood the test of time, they're all in the public domain. And then we categorize them by things like the 4 seasons: autumn, winter, spring, and summer. But then some categories like fellow travelers, creatures of the air, solitude, creatures of land and water, light bearers. And we've given them illustrations, beautiful watercolor illustrations, to
Mm-hmm.
attract children, especially those who can't read yet. And then we've included a little detail about the author, the poet, plus an exploratory comment. So let me give you an example. One of the poems that's super famous that my son Liam memorized was called The Eagle by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'm going to read it because it's nice and short, and then I'll share with you the details that went with that poem so you can think about how you might be able to share this in a family. So here's the poem. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled, the wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt, he falls. So that poem, for years, Liam would recite it and he'd say, and like a thunderbolt, he falls. He'd get really dramatic. It was quite adorable. So then underneath it, we talk about Alfred Lord Tennyson being a poet laureate when he was born. He's the 4th of 12 children, showed an early talent for writing, etc. But then we come along and we ask the question, we make these suggestions. Try going through the poem, The Eagle, line by line. What picture does it paint? What do you learn about the eagle? What do you think happens after the last line of the poem? So you
Mm-hmm.
picture this eagle falling like a thunderbolt. What's he going after? It's an interesting thing to ponder for a small child. Why would an eagle suddenly dive? So that's basically how we constructed this book. It's got a poem, a little bit of author detail, and then more ways to think about this poem moment. Just a little question.
Right. So, and I love it's just a gentle, I don't even want to call it an introduction because it's almost something different to analyzing. You're not ripping it apart. You're just, like you said, it's kind of adding one more layer to it. You're just, adding some more thought into it.
Exactly. In fact, let me do one more because these are fun. How Doth the Little Crocodile by Lewis Carroll.
Oh, so good. So good.
So good. So I will read the poem and then I will read you the questions that go with it because I think it's perfect. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. So what is the poem celebrating about the crocodile? Do you think the little fish would agree? And then I love this. What are the opposite messages in those ironic final lines? So the crocodile is welcoming in little fishes with gently smiling jaws. Do these fish agree? So that's the kind of thing that for children, my goodness, we take for granted this sense of irony, this kind of delightful pairing of our, opposite of our expectations. But for children, in some cases, it's their very first encounter with that kind of, mind scramble. And it can feel like an intellectual awakening, literally. Like, oh my gosh, I get the big inside joke here. It's very empowering for kids.
And that's a good segue because I was going to talk about poetry and our outside the box kids. So lots of my audience has children with autism or ADHD or dyslexia or other learning challenges. And that you nailed it because I've got one on the spectrum who is extremely literal. And so to introduce him, and those are things he won't catch. He's not just going to catch the irony. You really have to teach them intentionally. And poems like How Doth the Little Crocodile, we just, anything where it's taught intentionally or there's a joke or there's something at the end, you do have to sort of explain, do you know why that's funny or do you know why that's ironic, and walk him through the steps of that. And so he has grown so much through reading poetry and reading great literature in so many of these other areas of self-awareness because of the tricks and tools of the trade, so to speak, that poets use to get their point across. So would you say, and I know we talked about the reading being a big benefit to help kids read, but would you say it's especially powerful and soul-serving for these outside the box kids to have poetry in their lives?
Oh my gosh, so much. So my son Liam, who really clung to poetry even more than the other 4 kids, was dysgraphic and struggled with handwriting, but he could memorize poems. He had keen literary insight from a young age because he would sit in his bed and at night just read poetry to put himself to sleep. In fact, I did not know he did that. I found that out when he was 20. I didn't know he was secretly, he kept poetry stacked with comic books. So he knew DC Comics and poetry. Right. But think about that for a moment. These are both short form, right? So graphic novels and poetry really reduce the amount of text that you need to read. And so when he would do copy work, which was challenging for dysgraphic, he gravitated toward this shorter form. The second thing I would say about poetry for kids who are outside the box, not only does it showcase a range of human emotions and make them more accessible to kids for whom that's a challenge, it also features and highlights quirky kids because quirky kids are fun. And so you are actually running into kids who, eat too many pancakes, or always are running out of time, or dropping all of their, favorite supplies on the way to another room. Like, the poets themselves are quirky people.
Mm-hmm.
So they are featuring adults, children, animals in unconventional roles. And I think
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times that can be really powerful for children who feel a little bit like a misfit. There is a way to show up in the space that's really good for them. The last thing I was going to say, though, about this sort of poetry hooking up with kids who are outside the box, there was a mother who wrote to us. Her family had been in a serious car accident, and she had a child who had a hard time accessing his emotions. I don't know if he was on Asperger's spectrum or what, but he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't talk
Mm-hmm.
about his fears or the feelings that he had. He kept acting like everything was just fine. But this mother knew that he couldn't possibly be fine because it had been a very serious
Right.
accident. About 3 months later, she gets up in the morning, and there he is at the table, and he's written a poem in great detail about the
Mm.
accident, using onomatopoeia, the crash sounds, the way that the metal twisted, like all of it. And
Mm.
she wrote me a letter saying how grateful she was that the practice of reading poetry weekly had given him a tool for finding out how he could express feelings that weren't available to him in conversation.
Ah,
I was so moved by that, and I
that
think
is wonderful.
that's what poetry does. It's a whole
Yep.
additional vocabulary for self-awareness and self-expression.
Yes, absolutely. I think I think that is so true. And what a wonderful story. I'm glad she shared that with you. So I do want to ask you, and I know this might be a little bit like picking your favorite child, but do you have do you have a favorite poem or a favorite family poem, something that really and I'll give some backstory to this question, something that set the tone for your house, because for us it's A.A. Milne. When we first really started reading poetry and fell in love with them, we're huge Pooh fans, classic Pooh
Love it.
only. We're very prejudiced against anything besides. and,
That makes total sense.
um, very snobbish with our poo. So when we had read through the books, my daughter was only a year and a half or 2 years. So she was, in that toddler kind of whiny stage. And we had all memorized rice pudding. And if you know the refrain, it's "What is the matter with Mary Jane? She's crying with all her might and main, and she won't eat her dinner rice pudding again. What is the matter with Mary Jane?" And it just goes on and on about Mary Jane. There's all these things, we can't get her to calm down. And so anytime there was sort of a fit or a fallout with Gracie, it was, "What is the matter with Mary Jane?" We kind of had that in the background. But I always think that's almost like the soundtrack to their early years, were A.A. Milne poems. So do you have something like that where it's maybe a specific poem that you love or something that really was special to your family?
Oh man, you're right about the picking your favorite child. I mean, we love Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll.
Yeah.
That's got a whole bunch of nonsense words, and some of those words now have found their ways into video games. Like the Vorpal sword is in, I forget which game, but like Age of Empires or something. So
Right.
that's always really fun, right? When you see this sort of archaic thing show up in real life. And so my kids love Lewis Carroll and they love Shakespeare, of course. But there's
Mhm.
one poem for me that symbolizes the ability to really see symbolism in poetry, and the timing of it in our lives was significant. We had just moved from California to Ohio, and one of the most wonderful constants in our lives was this poetry tea time practice that started in California and we brought with us to Ohio. And the poem that suddenly meant so much to me and to us is Since Hannah Moved Away by
Mhm.
Judith Viorst. And it goes like this. And just note how she shows the feeling. She never tells you
Mhm.
what it feels like for losing Hannah. The tires on my bike are flat. The sky is grouchy gray. At least it sure feels like that since Hannah moved away. Chocolate ice cream tastes like prunes. December's come to stay. They've taken back the Mays and Junes since Hannah moved away. Flowers smell like halibut, velvet feels like hay. Every handsome dog's a mutt since Hannah moved away. Nothing's fun to laugh about, nothing's fun to play. They call me, but I won't come out since Hannah moved away.
Oh,
Makes me cry.
it is. We've had some pretty traumatic moves, so I can definitely relate to with that one. Oh, but you're right. She doesn't. I love that she doesn't. And that's a big writer rule. Show, don't tell. Don't tell. Don't insult your readers. That's what I can still hear my professor. Don't insult your readers. You want to show, and the best poems really do that. You don't need to know why you know how she feels.
Well, exactly. And in fact, we used that poem in our family as a model, and then we changed the refrain at the end. So since Hannah moved away, we can pick a different one. Since Grandma came to stay, we can choose a different one and build our metaphors to go with that, which has been a super powerful tool for us. I wanted to see if I could find, hold on a second, let me see if I can find this one poem my daughter wrote, because it's a good example of what I'm talking about. Okay, here we go. So in a similar way, when Johanna was 21 in a poetry writing class at Ohio State University, she wrote a poem about her experience of homeschool. And you've just heard me read Since Hannah Moved Away. I want you to notice the lesson that is deeply embedded in her, the show, don't tell. Okay, Here it goes. It's titled Homeschool. Lemon Pluto pudding and moon pies for constellation-themed parties, dissecting devilwood daylily buds, or formaldehyde frogs with friends nurse mom. Its savage garden full volume to cover angry words uttered to fractions worksheets. Fridays spent feigning French study between chapters of Chihuly, C-forms. Tradition, Tuesday tea time, PG tips, scones, poetry sharing. He clasps the crag from memory, merges with Maggie and Millie and Molly and May. Then, sisters scribbling in sketchbook. Three brothers backwards, eyes to the computer, minds divided. Me, attentive, knitting, while mom orates to her fondest beings, chuckling with E.B. White, aged understanding. Day ends mid-chapter when mom's eyes flutter, closed, and kids, unaware that homeschool is perpetual, think their learning is done.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So,
what a good legacy, too. I mean, what a beautiful, I don't know, that's like a graduation present to you,
it
in
was.
a box. What is most memorable and most fond, because that's really how we live. When we look back, that's how we remember things. We remember those little spurts, those little pictures, those little chunks. And that's such a beautiful example of that, of how she showed that.
Well, and I think, so what struck me especially at the time is so often we imagine that our homeschool experience is somehow failing to connect to our kids, and we can't figure out what they will remember. And what really stands out to me when I look at that poem and when I think about what my kids have shared with me since, is it is a mixture of all of those tangibles. It's the tea time, it's the way that they dissected things, they had theme parties, they remember listening to read alouds. Even their fraction worksheets are read, whatever music they're listening to at that stage in their lives. I found it really reassuring. And poetry, I think, has that way of telescoping, doesn't it? It sort of condenses or shrinks a big experience into its essentials. And that is a very reassuring way to evaluate your own existence, your own experience.
Right. Oh, I love that. Okay, before you go, please tell us quickly about your book, The Brave Learner, and maybe any other projects or speaking engagements. I know you were just at the Wild and Free conference because a friend of mine got to see you, and I was oh so jealous.
Oh, that's amazing.
But she loved you. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my book, The Brave Learner, is a compendium really of the lessons I've learned over the last 30 years of being related to the homeschool movement. So my own children and all the families that we've worked with in Brave Writer and in our coaching community, the Homeschool Alliance. And the goal of the book is to help parents actually understand what I just unfolded to you with Poetry Tea Time. How do we take what the parent values, which is some kind of academic, completed, fulfilling education, and pair it with the disposition, likes and dislikes of a child? How do we create the intersection that goes from you have to get through and get done to the epiphany that says, wow, I've learned that and it's mine and I am happy to know it. So that's what the book is about. And Poetry Tea Time is an interesting sort of picture of what that looks like. A lot of times we say, I want a happy learner or I want a lifelong lover of learning. But what we really mean as parents is, I hope I have a cooperative student, or I want my child to love what I teach. And the truth of the matter is, all the subjects are inherently interesting, and they are all connected to things your kids already enjoy and already want to know more about. So how do we create a pairing, something that invites them into that academic arena without killing their appetite for learning it? Poetry Tea Time is such a beautiful example of how that can happen so naturally, and we can certainly expand on that to all the subjects. So that's what that book's about. It came out last February, and we had a book tour from February through the end of September. And now, actually, Cindy, I am taking off all of 2020.
Oh!
So I will not be speaking anywhere publicly. I will do online webinars like I sometimes do, and hopefully we'll reboot the podcast after I have voice surgery. But we're using 2020 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Brave Writer. It starts in January, and we will be celebrating all year. And then we will kick off a new season of speaking engagements in 2021.
Oh, how fun. So if you missed Julie, just replay this podcast over and over and over.
That's right. That's right.
All right. So I know we can find you online at bravewriter.com. Are you taking off also social media?
No. I can't seem to ever do that. I run my own Instagram account. So if you're interested in, keeping up with me that way, I share a lot of homeschool support and writing instruction and just all things homeschool there. That's Julie Brave Writer is my user identity. And then for Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest, it's just Brave Writer. So either of those are good. And we love having you discover more about our online classes and our products at bravewriter.com. And then I have a coaching community that is about 800 strong. It is designed to give you monthly webinars and some delight-driven lesson plans every month. And we study learning itself, not just curriculum. So if you're interested in coaching for your emotional life and your homeschool, the Homeschool Alliance is the place we do that.
That's wonderful. Well, Julie, thank you so much for being on today. And thank you for all you do for the homeschool community. I know you are a major inspiration to so many.
Well, thank you, Cindy, for having me. It's wonderful to meet your audience, and I wish them all well.
Thanks so much for listening to Homeschooling Outside the Box. If you are loving the show, please head over to iTunes and leave a review. This is a great way to help other moms just like you find encouragement in their homeschool with their outside-the-box child as well. For more encouragement, be sure to head to cindyrenna.com and you can check out some great blog posts as well as a shop that will help equip you on your homeschooling journey.